Hello, everybody. How are you guys doing? Yeah. I came up at I have the best speaking slot because you all just got beer. And so I'm pretty excited about it. I wish every conference that I did gave everybody beer right before I went up because they're like, the talk could suck and who cares because I have a beer in my hand. So it's fine. So I hope to say hi to everybody and after this, and I can have more beer. But what I wanted to talk about, I was trying to figure out what is interesting to a company, right? Like I want to do something kind of relevant, and you guys are a very large, special company. I use Wix. I pay for Wix as well, so a very small part of your salary, I think, comes out of my pocket. But you guys probably all pay for GitHub, so thank you for that too. So I want to talk about. I was trying to figure out what to talk about because a lot of people, I think, a couple months ago really wanted to hear about AI, and I've been thinking about AI and really what's the future of software development, right? Like my background is GitHub, and so I care about software development a lot, and how will software development change, right, is really interesting. And you guys do something very interesting about software development, which is to try to take it away from people as much as possible, right? Like make it so that you can create stuff without having to write code. And I find that and AI kind of overlap in what it's trying, what it can do for software development, which is take more software development out, right, or simplified. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. My background, what I'm really interested in is version control. I've been doing version control professionally for a very long time. I've used it since I was in college. I'm very old, so for probably 25 years now, I've been doing version control stuff. But professionally, obviously, I worked at GitHub, and I thought about version control every day. I thought about developer workflows every day, how people collaborate, and how people work on stuff. I wrote a book, actually, Pro Git. If anybody's read this, you can read it online at the Git website. It's all open source as well. But I thought about version control and sort of writing that. If you've never written a book, my professional advice is do not write a book because you make no money, and it's a huge pain in the ass. But and right now, I'm working on, I'm a serial startup fan. Like, I just can't not work on startups. GitHub was sold. I don't have to work again a day in my life, but I choose to make my life very similar to your lives every day, where I sit and I write code and I try to write product. And I find it fascinating. I just love doing it. And so, but a lot of what I'm curious about, a lot of what I love is software development workflows and version control. I find it fascinating. So what I think is interesting about generative AI tools and sort of how that can affect our lives and how tools, no-code tools like Wix can affect our lives is it removes the how, right? It starts to remove a lot of the how do we build something out of your life. If you're doing a website on Wix, you're not thinking about what's the server you're running it on, or what's the code, or what's the JavaScript, or what's the CSS, or whatever, right? Hopefully you're able to take away some of that how from building product or from building something. And so I think in the future, what that leads to is that if there's less how, if that's less important for what you're building, then what becomes more important and more interesting is what are you building and why are you building it? What problems are you trying to solve? And what differentiates good product from bad product are people and teams that can think about this and work on this in a more valuable way or in a smarter way than anybody else. So what I want to share today is just what I learned from GitHub, what tools I brought out of GitHub into the other startups that I've had that have worked well for, I think, decades now, that I find very valuable in trying to evaluate why to build something and how and what to build, and less how to build it. Like that, I think that's becoming less important, right? And so the first tool that I want to share is a phrase that I've used a million times in the last 20 years because we talked about it all the time at GitHub, which is something called first principles. And so this is actually a term from physics, right? Which means the basic concept or assumption that you know to be true that's not deduced from anything else. So we make assumptions all the time. Everybody makes assumptions constantly, every day. And so I want to give an example of how to get to first principles because I find it an incredibly useful tool on why to build something. And ironically, the best tool, the way that you get to first principles, it's actually super, super easy. And if any of you have 3-year-olds, does anybody have a 3-year-old child? You guys are, okay, there's a lot of people with 3-year-olds in here, or somebody who's had a 3-year-old before. They have the best tool to get to first principles on anything, which is why. Because if you've had a 3-year-old, you'll say something, they'll see something, and they'll say why, and then you'll explain it. And it should be over, but it's not over, because what's the follow-up question? Why? Why? Because 3-year-olds don't know anything, right? Everything's new to them. They don't have assumptions. They don't have things that they're falling back on. They don't have a stopping point where they say, oh, I get it, right? Like, that works, right? Like, they'll just keep asking it, or to piss you off. It could be either. It really depends. But I want to share an example that I like. This was a story that was told by a physicist called Richard Feynman, if you know Feynman. I know the really cool physicist these days is Oppenheimer, but, I like Feynman. So, but he told this story about how to question things, right? And he said, Aunt Minnie's in the hospital. Why? Well, she fell and she broke her hip. Now, a lot of times, this could stop the conversation, right? If your grandma or whatever is like, hey, Aunt Minnie's in the hospital, why? She fell and broke her hip. Oh, that makes sense. I don't care about Aunt Minnie that much. I'm satisfied with this answer, right? But you can say, why? Why did she fall and break her hip? Maybe you care about Aunt Minnie a little bit more. And you could say, she slipped on some ice. Now, this answers some important questions you may have had with the previous statement, which is it serious, right? What did she do? Was she water skiing? Like, what was Aunt Minnie doing at the time? And it's like, she slipped on some ice, and so it's like, okay, she's probably going to survive. This isn't sort of the worst problem. And most people would stop right there. But when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true, right? And so most of us would stop there because asking why after that is not helpful, right? We all know why she slipped on ice, because ice is slippery, right? And so if you say why at this point, ice is slippery, seems like a stupid answer, right? Obviously, we all know why. We have this assumption. But if you ask it again, it becomes a really, really interesting question. Because how many people think about it? Do you know why ice is slippery? Like, it's not an easy question to answer. Why is ice slippery? Because ice is a solid. How many solids are slippery? There's almost no solids that are slippery. Anything unless there's water on it, unless there's oil on it, right? Unless there's grease on it, then yes, but it's not the solid that's slippery by itself. You step on stone, it's not slippery, right? No matter how smooth it is. So why is ice slippery? Well, I just Googled this the other day. This is published in 1 year ago, right? This is not an answered question. This is from the abstract. The origin of ice slipperiness has been a matter of great controversy for more than a century, but an atomistic understanding of ice friction is still lacking. Like, nobody knows why ice is slippery. We went from Aunt Minnie's in the hospital to an atomistic understanding of ice friction in 3 whys, right? Like, it's not that hard to get here. Like, no matter what you do, and you can do this to anything, right? Like, you can point at anything at your house. Why is the sky blue? Why are plants green? It doesn't really matter. If you get down 2 or 3 whys, you get to something interesting, and that's first principles. And you can apply this to anything. So I want to do this for version control, because that's what I'm working on right now. Git Butler that I mentioned before it's a Git client, right? I want to build a new Git client, and so it's an interesting question for version control. We've all you guys are all young enough. Most of you have probably only used Git in your whole professional lives, right? Like, maybe some of you are old enough and wise enough, let's say, to have used Subversion or CVS or Perforce or something else that was kind of more popular before that, but a lot of you probably haven't. And so let's look at this from a product perspective and why it's valuable. So I want to go through the whys, the first principles of version control. We all use Git. Why? Why do we use Git, right? I'd say we use Git because we need version control, right? We need to use version control, and it's a pretty good version control tool, or it's the tool that everybody uses. But why? Why do we need to use version control? What's the point of version control? Why do we need this tool in our lives? Well, we need to collaborate, and we need to save our work, and otherwise that's relatively difficult, right? So why? Why is that difficult to do? It's difficult to do because our computer doesn't save the history of our files, right? And it doesn't let other people access them. And so we need a tool to help us do that. If our computers did, if we had a file system that saved every version of every file that we had, then version control would be less interesting. If we could send a URL to any file on our file system to anybody else, version control would be less interesting. But we can't do that, right? But why? Why can't we do that? Why do our file systems not do that? They're secure? There's lots of good reasons, right? But it's interesting to kind of break down all the way to the bottom and build it back up again. And so if we look at history saving and file access, we might think, well, obviously we need version control tools for that. But there's actually a very good example that we all use as well that has version control but does it completely differently than Git does, which is Google Docs, right? Google Docs does not have this problem. You're still writing a document. It's not that different from source code, right? You're writing some document, you're writing some file out. It's saving everything you do. You don't commit in Google Docs, right? You have the history of everything. You can share, you can collaborate with people. It just does it in a very, very different way. And so the first principles of version control is interesting to me. Like, why don't we have a version control system that takes some of the better elements of Google Docs? Like, why does Git not have any of those elements? Why isn't it saving my stuff all the time for me automatically? Why is it not helping me to collaborate with people or sharing things? I have to commit and push it to GitHub, right? Git itself is not doing that. And so I find that very interesting from a product perspective. But I think I'm doing this because this is the product I'm working on, but it goes for any product, anything you're working on, any product, any feature. If you look at it and you say, what am I trying to solve, right? What am I really trying to do? And have the first question be, what are the first principles, right? What are we really trying to solve? Not adding another feature to do something specific, but to say, let's back out, let's ask why, let's be 3-year-olds for a second, and come back to the first principles of what am I really trying to solve with the thing that we're trying to do here, and does it make sense what we're building based on those first principles? As long as everybody on the team can agree on what the first principles are, then it's an interesting conversation, but it also sparks ideas of how to build better product, and I find that very interesting. So the next question, now that we have the why are we building this, what are the first principles of what we're building, is what? What are we going to build, right? And I feel like engineers are specifically very bad at what we're going to build because you can see this sort of in Git as well, how Git was designed by engineers, because I think what engineers tend to do a lot is say, what can we build, right? And what I'd rather say, what I like to do is look at any feature or any product, anything you're adding to something and say, what question is this answering? Because it helps put you into the perspective of the user that's going to use it. What question do they have in their mind? What are they trying to accomplish, right? If I put in a new widget or a new feature or something, what question is this answering for them, rather than what can we do? Because I think us as engineers, it's very easy to say, here's the data that we have, right? And so I'll just expose the data and I'll let you sort of manipulate the data or whatever, and it can solve your problem, but it's not necessarily solving the problem. What you want to say is, what's the user trying to do? What question do they have that they're trying to answer? And is this the best way to answer it, right? And it doesn't really matter technically how it's done. Really great example of this in Git, actually, as long as I'm talking about version control, is git log, right? So you guys all use git log, you know what that does. But what question is git log answering, right? The question that the tool answers is, what are the last couple of commits that I have on this branch? But is that the question that users really want to answer? That's not generally the question, right? They want to know a lot of different things that you can answer with git log. What are the commits on this branch that aren't integrated into upstream, right? Do you know off the top of your head how to get git log to give you that? It's easy, it's doable, but it's more difficult. That's not the default design that the tool is answering. The other thing I really like, actually, git log is a subway map, right? If you think about subway maps, subway maps are not that useful, right? It gives you all the information and makes you answer your question based on way too much information. So what the question that users are answering when they're looking at a subway map is, how do I get from where I am to where I want to go using this? And it's actually a very small amount of that information. What's much better at answering the same question is Google Maps, right? Because it has more contextual data, but it also answers the question better. And so I think of git log as a subway map. And what I want to build, what we all should want to build, is the Google Maps, right? You want to say, what is the question, what are they trying to answer, and what's the best possible way of answering the question that they have? So I want to share a quick story about GitHub pull requests, because looking back on the development of GitHub and how we built GitHub, I find it that we didn't do it right in some cases and stumbled into something that was okay at the end. But like, let's look at GitHub pull requests. Does anybody know why GitHub pull requests are called pull requests? Raise your hand if you think you know. Nobody does. A couple people, very smart people in the back. So obviously this is a GitHub pull request. You guys are using this a lot, but the phrase comes from a command in Git. Now, there are probably 250 commands in Git of various, some of them are meant to be used, some of them are sort of in the back, like meant to be sort of scripted. But this is one. So in the old days, when I was a young lad, people were collaborating with Git. They would, you'd take Linus's kernel or something. Let's say you wanted to do contribute to the Linux kernel. You would take Linus's kernel, you do a couple of commits, and then you'd run a command called git send email. And it would take those commits, it would extract patches out of them, and it would send it to a mailing list. And the reason that you have a commit message is because that is the body of the email that's sent to the mailing list, right? And so you would format your message as what you wanted your email to look like that was introducing the change that you wanted to try to convince people was acceptable to the kernel. And over time, that was kind of how it started because everybody was using mailing lists. And over time, you'd have big patches or whatever, and you'd say, you know what, this is stupid. I'm not going to mail all the patches to you. Instead, I'll put them on my server, and then I'll send you a URL that says pull them from my server, right? Just add a git remote and pull them down and then look at them and decide if you want to merge them. It's much easier than maybe looking at all of these patches over a mailing list. And so they created this command. All it does, it still exists. You can still run it. I ran it to do the next screenshot. It just gives you text that you can email to somebody that says, here's a public URL, here's what the branch is called, here's a summary, here's a diff stat, here's kind of, what this is going to look like, but here's where the code exists. And so if you want to, you can add this. You can just pull it down into a branch, test it out, decide if you want to merge it in. That's up to you. And so if you run git request pull, then what you end up as a noun is a pull request, right? And so we were like, okay, let's do this. So the first version, so GitHub launched in 2008. We had a pull request button from day one, and all it did was send an email that looks like this. And it would just say, it'd give you a little text box, you type in the message, you fork the code, you added some commits, you changed it, however, and then you send the original person that you don't have write access to their repository, you say, hey, I did some stuff, you might want to pull it in, right? And this is how good our user interface was back then. This is what my email inbox looked like in 2009, right? So any open source project that I was part of, if people did some changes, I wouldn't even be able to see what it was. This is literally all the information I had. I had to go look at their code. I had to add their branch. I had to pull it down. I had to check it out. I had to decide if I wanted to merge it. All of the user interface was on the command line. It was local, right? We did nothing but host and then send messages to people that said, hey, this person wants to pull from you. And essentially what you'd have to do is this, right? You'd create a new branch. You'd say git pull, the URL. You can still do this. This still works, right? But it's just not very many people do this anymore because now it's harder to have a conversation about it. You have to inspect this locally. You have to decide if you want to. And if you want to, you can merge in that branch you pulled this work into, and you can push it to your server, right? And so this is how we did this. You would think, how GitHub is used now, you would think that pull request was GitHub, right? Like that is what people really value. It was 2 years after the launching of Git, It was 2 years after the launching of Git. We had 200,000 of these emails that were sent in the first 2 years of GitHub. This was the entire pull request interface. And so GitHub didn't start with pull request. It didn't start with collaboration really at all, except for this stupid email that went out. And then we said, oh, okay, well, people are pulling stuff down and they want to look at it, and so maybe we'll help them do that. And so we did this thing called a compare view. So you couldn't merge it in. You couldn't even really comment on, you could go and comment on individual commits, but this would just allow you to see what was different on their branch rather than yours in a slightly nicer way, and you could send a URL for it. And actually, this little 3-dot syntax over here, that is the syntax that you use in git log to find this difference, right? And so that if you run git log master ... branch name, it'll show you what's on branch name that's not on master. So that's actually how you get this, right? And then we said, okay, let's make it so you can have a discussion around this, that it's an object, a pull request is an object, and you can have a discussion and talk about the changes and maybe push more changes or something. And so this is an example. This is what pull requests look like in the first iteration. If you guys aren't old enough to have seen a, circa 2010 pull request. But there was no merge button. You couldn't actually merge this online. You could just talk about it and see the difference, and it made it so you weren't running git diff and git log locally to figure out what the pull request was about. But you still had to do this, right? You could look at it and talk about it, but in the end, you had to pull it down and you had to merge it locally and push it back up. And then another year later, we had merge button, and now I think that's completely changed how people think about collaborating, right? But what's interesting to me is going back to the first thing of what is the user's question, of thinking about this. We did not go down to first principles. We just copied what was there, right? It was this iterative process of, we didn't sit down and say, how are people trying to collaborate, and how can we facilitate that in the best possible way? I feel like we could have gotten here much faster and probably, honestly, much better. I think our iterative strategy has stuck us all with pull requests, which have their downsides, right? But it's how we got there. I almost wish I could go back in time when we had started this and said, let's go to first principles, let's think about what people are trying to do, let's look at patterns of how people want to collaborate, and build this from scratch differently and better, right? But now we're stuck with it, so sorry. So the other thing, once you figure out what you want to build a pull request, you want to build feature A, whatever it is, there's one more thing that I think is really valuable, right? Of saying, okay, we know what the first principles are, we know what the problem is, we know what we want to build at a fundamental level. So how are we deciding what exactly to build? What to leave in, what to leave out? And my favorite thing, one of the things, again, that we talked about a lot at GitHub was this concept of taste. And because when you're one designer and a couple of engineers, it's relatively easy to align on what the taste of the company is, what the taste of the product is, how it should feel, how people should feel when they use it, right? But when it gets bigger, you have people with other opinions, you have people with other types, concepts of taste, and it's hard to stay aligned on what does it mean to be a Wix product, what does it mean to be a GitHub product, right? How do we make those decisions? And our designer Kyle saw an interview with Steve Jobs. Now, my company got bought by Microsoft. I still have a lot of Microsoft stock, and so I'm not trying to shit on Microsoft. But I find this quote very funny, and we quoted this all the time. This was an interview with Steve Jobs where he was saying the problem with Microsoft is that they have no taste, right? And my favorite part of this is, I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a big way. So just to further, just get the knife in, right? He could have stopped with just kind of insulting them, but then he was like, I don't mean they're kind of dumb, I mean they're massively, right? And so I love that, but we used to say that a lot in GitHub, and I find it very funny. But the sense they don't think of original ideas, they don't bring much culture into their products. But I love this idea of, whether you agree with that or not, of this idea of Microsoft's taste is different than Apple's taste, right? And so you can like one or the other, but the idea is, as a company, do you have an idea, you have a concept, a shared understanding of what the taste of your product is, right? Because if you do, it makes it easier to decide how to build what to build, right? Like what it looks like, what it feels like, what is the taste of your products. And so I'll share how GitHub did this. I don't know if you guys have something like this, if you have something to but we had these sort of, we called it the Zen of GitHub. We had these Zen, these short statements that we all decided that we agreed on. And whenever a product decision came up and we were trying to figure out how do we execute this, what design decisions are we going to make? How does the product going to feel? We would reference this list and we would apply it. We would say, does it match with this list of these sort of Zen idioms, right? And so this is the Zen of GitHub. This is what we ended up with and what we kind of agreed on. And there's a lot of them. There's too many of them, honestly. We probably should have culled it down a little bit. But there's a couple of them that I still use. Every startup the two startups I've done, the last 8 years, I guess, I haven't been at GitHub. Every time that I'm thinking about product, every time I'm trying to figure out what to build, there's a couple of these that I still really like and I still really use, and I think really helped make GitHub a very good product. And I want to just talk about them very quickly. My favorite one is anything added dilutes everything else. And this is probably my favorite statement on product design ever. I use this I think about this all the time. I use this all the time. Whenever we're working on product, whenever we're looking at what are we building exactly, I love saying, yes, we can add this feature, but understand that everything added dilutes everything else, right? Anything you put in makes everything else that's there a little bit more difficult to find, a little bit more difficult to understand, especially for new users, right? Not for us, maybe, not for people working on the product or people who've been using a product for a long time, but for new users or for people that aren't power users. Everything added dilutes everything else. And so it has to be worth it, right? If you want to add it, it really needs to provide value that is better than the dilution of everything else that's in your product. The other is practicality beats purity. I love this. I love being practical. There's a lot of sort of, you'll get this a lot, right? These sort of religious wars about language or about what technology to use or whatever. And in the end, I think it doesn't really matter if it's a little bit ugly, right? Or as long as it's practical, as long as it really solves somebody's problem, right? And so it doesn't matter if it doesn't fit in with the rest of the design system, maybe, right? As long as it solves the problem in the most practical way, that also works. And so if the decision is between practicality and purity, always choose practicality. The other is encourage flow, right? So I always like this idea of not just throwing these tools in, but trying to say, here's how you should walk through the tools. Here's what the next step is, right? Here's, if you don't know what to do next, we'll suggest something, right? And make it so that your tools can provide somebody with a flow that you're encouraging, and that really helps people to do what they're trying to do. Favor focus over features. This is actually relatively similar to anything added dilutes everything else, but I also like this idea of it's not actually we used to say no way more than yes at GitHub, right? Especially with clients, we get some big client or something, and it's like, I want this feature, and every single time we'd have to say, we prefer focus, right? We're not going to build something specifically for Ruby users or specifically for this language community or something. We really want to make sure that everything's focused. And the last one, before I wrap up, is speak like a human. And I've always really loved this. Actually, GitHub had this idea of a GitHub voice, of what GitHub sounded like. And every time we try to write, because it's not all about features and buttons and functionality, some of it is about language and communication and what does your product sound like, right? When somebody's reading text, what is that voice? Is it a super corporate voice, right? Actually, my favorite thing is customer service, right? We used to think about this all the time, what is customer service like? And try to say, here's what the voice of GitHub sounds like, and make sure that you're communicating in that way. So not platitudes, try to make it funny, try to make it smart, right? Try to make it succinct. And we had a person in mind. I don't know if you guys know another physicist, an astrophysicist. I'm just going to talk about physicists all day. Neil deGrasse Tyson is this physicist that is an amazing, amazing communicator, an amazing speaker. And we used to have that as a benchmark. We'd make customer service people and marketing people watch videos of him and say, this is what we want GitHub to sound like, right? A little bit funny, very smart, succinct. That is the voice. If you can't read copy of any kind, something on the website or customer service email or marketing copy, and it doesn't sound like Neil deGrasse Tyson would say that, then that shouldn't be what the copy should be like. And I loved having this idea of what does your product sound like. So, as a fun little thing, GitHub runs a Cowsay server. So I don't know if anybody's ever used Cowsay, but if you go to api.github.com/Octocat, it'll give you a little ASCII art Octocat that says one of these 12 phrases randomly. So if you ever need some daily inspiration, if you're working on a product and you're like, what would GitHub do? Just go here and then see what Mona Lisa tells you. The Octocat's name is Mona Lisa, by the way. So I'll wrap up. My point is, the biggest problems in the future are, I think, with AI, with no-code tools, with making it easier to create without having to get as far down in the weeds as we did before. The biggest problems in the future are about what to build and not about how specifically to build them. And my advice, take it or leave it, is I've found this very valuable to discover the first principles of whatever it is that you're trying to build. Put yourself in the place of the user that you're trying to solve these problems for, and then solve those problems with taste. That's it. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. If anybody has any questions or dumb GitHub stories or something that they want, I'm also happy to just drink with you guys and tell the stories where they're being less recorded, maybe. But yeah, if anybody has any questions that I can answer before we break for beer, I'm happy to do it. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, why did we make GitHub? Like, is it some personal pain point, or did we, think we were going to make a bunch of money? And the question is, or the answer is that it started out as a side project, and so it was definitely a personal pain point, I suppose. At the time, I loved Git. We were kind of getting into Git. The whole open source community that I was involved in used Subversion, so. If you've never used Subversion, it's horrible. Don't use Subversion. But we wanted to move some of our open source projects to Git, and there was no good hosting solution. There was like one, and it was like, it was very sketchy, and we weren't sure that it was going to be around or that it would be up, or you couldn't pay for it or anything. And so we were like, we'll just do our own and put it up as a side project. And it started out as a free open source hosting as a side project. And then one day, our friend Jeffrey Grosenbach came to us and was like, I'd really like to use this for a professional project, but I need it to be private. Can I pay you? And we were like, interesting. Let me work on that. You can pay us. And then wrote a billing system over the weekend. And then on Monday, we're like, please pay us. And it just kind of took off from there. Other people started supporting us that way. But like, it was really an accident. Like we just wanted to see something in the world and have something that we wanted. And it turned out that a lot of other people like us wanted it too. And we grew it really accidentally. Yeah. Anything else? Sorry, I can't. Yeah.
What was the idea about how Git merge works as opposed to rebase?
Oh. This is where I lose the audience. I already see it. I can tell I can even see the interpersonal conflicts arise within the audience now. So some of you won't like this, and some of you will really love this. But I always recommend merge. Yeah, I know. I'm so sorry. I do because what I really want to know, actually, I think, especially with GitHub, I think that each individual commit has really been watered down, right? Because we use pull requests really to say, like, you do a pull request, and then a lot of people won't want to force push to a branch, and you have all the conversation and everything there already. And so instead of re-rolling a series like you would on a mailing list, people will just add more commits sort of to the end to address problems, right? And then that kind of dilutes the value of the documentation of the commit itself, and you lose it in blame, and there's, And so what I really want to know is more just a list of the merges, right? Because if you can run a log that just says just follow right, and it just shows you one side, right? And so you can say, just tell me all the merges I have and not all the individual commits, because that's much more valuable to me, because that really encapsulates what are the changes that are coming into my code base. And also, I also, for long-running branches, instead of, if you have long-running branches, you can rebasing them all the time, or working with somebody else and you're rebasing stuff and force pushing to brand, it's such a nightmare, right? Like, and so I always like just throw in merge stuff and then have tooling that takes out the merge. The only thing you really lose is things like bisect. But I mean, I've been doing Git for 15 years and I think I've bisected a code base 3 times. Like it's just, I just don't care. Like I don't need that purity. I need practicality, and merges to me lose less data and are more practical. So that's my answer. But fight amongst yourselves. Yes.
What do you think made GitHub more successful than other products that provide, let's say, similar capabilities?
So, I mean, I think it's really just because we were at the right time at the right place. Like, I think we had good product design. I think we had good taste in what we were doing, which you don't see in something like Jira, right? Like, or, you know, sorry. I'm sorry, but it's true. But I think really we were at the beginning of this distributed version control war, and I think it was really between Git and Mercurial, and I think if we had chosen Mercurial, like, it's arguable if we had chosen Mercurial and done the same things, maybe maybe we made enough of an influence that would have taken over. That might be a little bit arrogant of me. But I think we were there at the beginning and we had an influence, and also Android was using Git, and so a lot of, you know, Qualcomm and Google and Motorola, and like there were a lot of companies that were embracing Git because of Android, because of Linux, right? And so there was that push as well. And I think we grew a community out of the Ruby community, so we focused on one very specific thing and won it over, and it spread in a way that nobody else could do. But also, the more important thing is that there was nothing else around, right? Like we weren't really, nothing else hosted Git repositories. And so we happened to be at the right place of, I think, doing something well and being at the beginning of that community and being focused on it. And yeah, I mean, Bitbucket came along a little bit later and tried to do the same thing, largely by copying what we did and then GitLab even later by exactly copying what we did. And even they were very successful, right? They're a public company. Like it's not like even the second runner-up in this space still is huge, right? Like, but yeah, so I don't really know. I think a lot of it was luck and timing. Yeah, last question.
Did you ever get any feedback from Linus about GitHub?
I did not. So I've never talked to Linus. I've never met him, actually. We were at the same conference one time, but we've gotten feedback secondhand. So he hates GitHub. Very specifically, he hates the pull request, right? He hates it. But there was one time when kernel.org went down, and that's where his tree was hosted, and he didn't have a good backup host, and so he created a mirror. We gave him a mirror. We were like, no, we've reserved this for you in case you come to your senses. And he pushed his tree there, and he maintains it to this day. He's always had it up, and I remember that he did this press interview once that said, I hate GitHub, but they are a very good hosting provider. And so I was like, fuck it, I'll take it. That's fine. Although I've heard, because he just really doesn't want people to use pull requests. He doesn't like the way that we do the model. He doesn't like that people are collaborating that way, but he gets it. Dumber people have to use pull requests. Smart people use mailing lists. That's fine, right? Like that's kind of his thing. That's his taste. It's totally fine. But I did hear an anecdote, and I'll end in this, which I find endlessly amusing. I have not verified this, so please don't quote me on it, but it comes from a very reputable source. Linus's daughter interned at GitHub very recently and started an open source project, and her dad wanted to help her with it and opened up a pull request to her project on GitHub and then said, you know what, it's not that bad. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. It was very inspiring. Okay, before we let you go out to the party, did you have fun today? Yeah? All right, so I want to invite to the stage the people that made this incredible day. So come on, all the speakers, come to the stage. Come on. Finalists, Amit. Come on, we're gonna do the selfie thing. Where is Scott? Scott, you're also a speaker. Where are you? Okay, guys, I'd like to thank everyone. And we're going to do the selfie thingy. But before we do the selfie thingy, there are two more people that made this entire event happen. Smadar and Moad. Thank you very much. If you're here, come to the stage. Come, take a bow. So the Academy team, they worked day and night really for weeks to make this thing happen. Come. You deserve it. Whoa. Okay, now everybody stand up for the picture. We're gonna do the trick. Stand up. Music! Guys, Happy New Year! Let's go to the party.